George Washington's administration is dominated by Alexander Hamilton. And Hamilton had a particular vision of America. He saw commerce, industry, banking as the future of the country. And Hamilton was always a man who wanted to ingratiate himself or please the wealthy and the powerful. And that's what Hamilton is going to do when he gains control of our government. Now, Washington was kind of an absentee president in a lot of ways. He was never a great intellectual to begin with, and he found the business of running the country fairly dull. Jefferson was a strong and brilliant personality, but as Secretary of State, he immediately had to get on a boat and go to Europe and handle American diplomatic affairs. So that left Hamilton to run the government from his job as Secretary of the Treasury. Jefferson, by the way, as the leader of the Democratic Republicans, had a differing vision. He saw an America of kind of middle-class, self-sustaining farmers, and feared business and modern advancement in many ways. Hamilton will propose an economic plan, and the details of his plan are these. First off, he says we need to start paying down our debt, but also take out more debt. Hamilton believed that we should have a lot of debt to other countries and powerful people because he said that they would be invested in our country. Literally, they would want to see us succeed, and they would support the United States if we borrow money from them because they know that if we fail, they won't get paid back. He also wanted to pay back the bonds that we had given to soldiers at face value. We'll talk about why that's a big issue, but we had paid our soldiers during the Revolutionary War in many cases with bonds or government promises to pay them back. And some people didn't want to pay them at full value, and he did, but I'll get into that in just a minute. He wanted a Bank of the United States. This is a bank that would be, for the most part, run by private individuals, which is to say bankers, but it would hold America's money. So when America collected taxes or revenue in some way, they would put it in the bank, and then they would pay it out of that bank. And again, he said we need the banks to support the country because the banks are powerful. So if we give them the ability to do this, then they're more likely to support us. There were going to be tariffs, which are taxes on imports. He didn't want American manufacturers to have to compete with the British goods, so if we just put large taxes on British goods, he figured that would solve the problem. And finally, the sale of public land, I should add that. Remember, Jefferson has organized a plan to sell off the land in the West, and the money from the sale of that land would fund the government. And finally, a tax on whiskey. And we'll talk about why the whiskey tax is going to end up being so controversial as we move along here. Many in Congress were angry to see speculators profiting from the soldiers. Here's what I mean. The soldiers got paid in bonds, and the soldiers were often very poor. They were kind of regular to poor people. And they didn't really have a lot of faith that the bonds would ever get paid anyway, but they were also likely to end up desperate for cash at some point. And so most of the bonds that had been given to the men who actually fought for the freedom of this country had later been sold to a banker or a speculator for a fraction of their value. And so a soldier might have $100 bond, $1,000 bond, whatever it may be, and he might sell it to a banker for $5. And so many people were angry that Hamilton wanted to pay all these bonds back at full value because it would not be the people who actually fought for the country benefiting. Madison wanted to, anytime a soldier didn't have his original bond, he said we should give half the money to the bank, or to whoever bought it, to the speculator, and half the money to the soldier. But Hamilton argues that a government, if it borrows money, it has to promise to pay those debts, and it has to live up to that promise. And this will be a great fight that goes on here in the early days of the country. Hamilton also then proposes that the federal government should pay the debts for all the states. Now, some states are angry about this. States like Virginia have a very small debt, and they're very angry about having to pay for the debt for a state like Massachusetts, which has incurred a massive debt. Hamilton is having a hard time getting this plan through, and so he decides to try to get Jefferson to support him, figuring that if Jefferson has his back, if the two of them unite on an issue, that nobody will be able to stand against it. And so the story goes, and it may or may not be true, that he meets Jefferson down on the dock as Jefferson arrives from Europe one day, and he takes him to dinner, and they work out a deal. Hamilton gets his way on the economic plan, and Jefferson wants to help pick where the capital will be. The Constitution has said they're going to create a special district to put the U.S. capital in, but they haven't figured out where that's going to be yet. and Jefferson wants it in the South. And back then, in Jefferson's mind, most people's mind, the South meant Virginia. And so Jefferson, the story goes, made a deal to allow Hamilton to have his economic plan if Jefferson got to put the capital in the South. Jefferson banking or gambling that if the capital was surrounded by southern states, the Southerners would be able to influence the politicians in the capital and get their way. When Hamilton agrees, Jefferson gives the right to pick the capital to Washington, and Washington actually picks a fairly bad spot for the capital. He puts it in the middle of a swamp. You can see here where it says Old Town, on the Potomac River. And he does it because it's right by Washington's house. It's also right by Jefferson's house because they were more or less neighbors. But Washington actually owned a lot of this land and the land around it. And Washington, people don't criticize Washington very much, but this was kind of a crooked land deal. Washington bought all the land around this, then said, let's put the capital here, and then sold all the land when the value went up when it was announced the capital was going to be there. So the capital is there mainly to benefit George Washington's pocketbook. So I guess it's appropriate it's called Washington. The Democratic Republicans will argue against Hamilton's plan. They'll say the Constitution does not give you the right to charter a bank. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you can create a bank. And Hamilton points to these three magic words that had been put in the Constitution that say Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper to meet its mandates. Well, Jefferson is horrified. He says, well, wait a minute, that's an elastic clause. It can be stretched to fit anything. It gives the federal government the power to do anything it wants. And Hamilton basically says, exactly. And so these three words, necessary and proper, will allow the Constitution, which was argued as being this incredibly limited document that didn't let the government do anything, these three words will mean that the federal government can do almost anything, or at least that's how it's been interpreted. Many people argue that and are still angry about that even today. But nonetheless, the bank opens in 1791. And Jefferson takes his argument to Congress, and they don't really care. Let's talk about the whiskey tax. Oh, whoops, there it is. Let's talk about the whiskey tax. The problem with the whiskey tax was not about people who wanted to drink. It was about farmers. The whiskey tax hit the Western farmers heavily. And it wasn't because they drank more per se. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. I don't know. But the thing is, if you were growing a grain and you had leftover grain at the end of the year, it would go bad. And so if you're a farmer, that sucks because that's your crop. That's how you make money. And so the farmers would turn their leftover grain into whiskey because whiskey's good for years. So basically it was a way of not losing your surplus grain. And then they would, of course, bring that whiskey across the Appalachians and they would sell it to people on the East Coast. And so when Hamilton proposes a whiskey tax, he's knowingly and intentionally proposing a tax that's going to hurt the poor farmers to the west because he doesn't really care about them. Now, they will rise up in rebellion. Here you see him tar and feathering a tax collector. And George Washington will become the first and only president in the history of the United States to ride out at the head of an army and put down the Whiskey Rebellion. But it's a great example of how Hamilton picked and had this policy of picking and choosing who he was going to hurt and who he was going to help with his economic policies. And who he was going to help was going to be large landowners, businessmen, wealthy merchants, Easterners, East Coasters, and who he was going to hurt was going to be everybody else. One thing that most of our founding fathers had been united on is they did not like what they called faction. Faction is what today we call parties. These are people who organize to take control of the government. Today that's the Democratic and Republican parties. But the people who wrote the Constitution and the people who fought the Revolutionary War constantly talked about factions as being terrible. The revolutionary generation in particular was mortified by the idea. They were totally terrified of faction. But nonetheless, Alexander Hamilton created the first political party in American history, the Federalist. And they were immediately accused of corruption. And those who opposed them organized around Jefferson and came to be called the Democratic Republicans. This is the first party system. These are two political parties fighting for control of the government. They organized for elections, meaning they tried to turn voters out. They published newspapers. They both claimed that the other was a party, was a faction, was a group of people conspiring to control the government, and their own party was simply, freedom-loving patriots standing up to stop the evil other party. Madison was also a leader of the Democratic Republicans, so their leaders are Madison and Jefferson, and they liked this idea of the yeoman farmer, the independent farmer. They feared urbanization, industrialization. The Federalist versus Democratic Republicans can be looked at in a lot of ways. Urban versus rural, farming, manufacturing versus farming. There was a North-South split, with Northerners more likely to be Federalists and Southerners more likely to be Democratic Republicans, and an East-West split, with Easterners more likely to be Federalist and Westerners more likely to be Democratic Republicans. But this political fight between the two would be the central battle politically in the early days of the country. They were also divided, by the way, on foreign policy. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans tended to like the French, and who had recently had their own revolution and declared independence and become a democracy inspired by America. Whereas the Federalists tended to prefer Britain because we did a lot of trade with Britain, and that's where a lot of these people were making their money, by doing business with Britain, even though they were still a monarchy, so they were attacked by the Jeffersonian Republicans for being monarchists.